Feudalism. Feudalism was the system in 10th to 13th century European medieval societies where a social hierarchy was established based on local administrative control and the distribution of land into units, fiefs. A landowner, lord, gave a fief, along with a promise of military and legal protection, in return for a payment of some kind from the person who received it, vassal. The payment of the vassal to the lord typically came in the form of feudal service, which could mean military service or the regular payment of produce or money. Both lord and vassal were freemen, and the term feudalism is not generally applied to the relationship between the unfree peasantry, serfs or villeins, and the person of higher social rank on whose land they labored. Although the term feudalism and feudal society are commonly used in historical texts, scholars have never agreed on precisely what those terms mean. The terms were applied to European medieval society from the 16th century onwards and subsequently to societies elsewhere, notably in the Zhou period of China, 1046 to 256 BC, and the Edo period of Japan, 1603 to 1868. The term feudalism was not used by the people who lived in the Middle Ages. Neither can the feudal system, once defined, be applied uniformly across different European states, as there were variations in laws and customs in different geographical areas and in different centuries. As a consequence, many historians believe that the term feudalism is only of limited use in understanding medieval societies. The word feudalism derives from the medieval Latin terms feudalis, meaning fee, and feudum, meaning fief. The fee signified the land given, the fief, as a payment for regular military service. The system had its roots in the Roman manorial system and in the 8th century kingdom of the Franks, where a king gave out the land for life to reward loyal nobles and receive service in return. The feudal system proper became widespread in Western Europe from the 11th century onwards, largely thanks to the Normans, as their rulers carved up and dished out lands wherever their armies conquered. Starting from the top of society's pyramid, the monarch, a good example is William the Conqueror, 1066 to 1087, who considered all the lands of England as his personal property, could give a parcel of land to a noble who, in return, would be that monarch's vassal. That is, he would promise loyalty and service when required. Thus, a personal bond was created. The most common and needed service was military service. Military obligations included fighting in that monarch's army or protecting assets of the crown, such as castles. In some cases, a money payment, known as scutage, which the monarch then used to pay mercenary soldiers, might be offered instead of military service. The vassal received any income from the land, had authority over its inhabitants, and could pass the same rights on to his heirs. The nobles who had received land, often called suzerain vassals, could have much more than they either needed or could manage themselves, and so they often sublet parts of it to tenant vassals. Once again, the person was given the right to use and profit from this land, and in return, in one form or another, then owed service to the landowner. This service could again take the form of military service, typical in the case of a knight, or, as tenants might be of a lower social class, but still be freemen, and might not have had the necessary military skills or equipment. More usually they offered a percentage of their revenue from the land they rented, either in money or produce, or, later in the Middle Ages, made a fixed payment of rent. There were also irregular special fees to be paid to the lord, such as when his eldest daughter married or his son was knighted. The arrangement which created a vassal was known as homage, as they often knelt before their particular feudal lord and swore an oath of loyalty, for which, in return, they not only received the land but also their lord's protection if and when required. The promise of protection was no small matter in times of war, when there were frequent raids from hostile neighboring states, and when there was a perpetual danger of general banditry. Protection also came in the form of legal support and representation if a vassal found himself in a civil or church court. A tenant usually handed down their tenancy to their heir, although it was sometimes possible to sell the right of tenancy to a third party, provided the lord who owned the land agreed. Another type of relationship in feudal societies, especially in medieval Germany and France, involved the allod, an inalienable property, i.e. one that could not be taken back. Holders of an allod still owed some form of allegiance to a superior local lord, but the relationship was not based on land ownership, and so that allegiance was harder to enforce. The feudal system perpetuated itself as a status quo because the control of land required the ability to perform military service and, because of the costs involved, of weapons, armor, and horses, the land was required to fund military service. Thus there was a perpetual divide between the landed aristocracy, monarchs, lords, and some tenants, and those who worked the land for them who could be free or unfree laborers. Unfree laborers were serfs, also known as villeins, who were at the bottom of the social pyramid and who made up the vast majority of the population. The peasantry worked, without pay, on the land owned or rented by others to produce food for themselves and, just as importantly, food and profit for their masters. They were often treated as little more than slaves and could not leave the estate on which they lived and worked. The term feudalism, however, is generally applied by modern historians only to the relationship between lords and vassals, and not the peasantry. Rather, the relationship between serfs and landowners or tenants is referred to as the manorial system after the most common unit of land, the manor. The consequence of the feudal system was the creation of very localized groups of communities that owed loyalty to a specific local lord who exercised absolute authority in his domain. As fiefs were often hereditary, a permanent class divide was established between those who had land and those who rented it. The system was often weighted in favor of the sovereign, as when a noble died without an heir, his estate went back to the monarch to either keep for themselves or to redistribute to another noble. Monarchs could distribute land for political purposes, fragmenting a noble's holdings or distancing him from the court. It also became difficult to keep track of who owned what, which led to such controls as the Domesday Book of 1087. Additional effects were the presence of vassals in the local courts which deliberated on cases involving the estates of their lords. Thus, there could be a clear conflict of interest and lack of impartiality, even if the more serious criminal cases were referred to the courts of the crown. In addition, the system of feudal relationships could create serious unrest. Sometimes a monarch might insist on active military service because of war, but nobles might also refuse, as happened to King John of England in 1215 and the Barons' Revolt, which led to the signing of the Magna Carta. In 1215, and in subsequent revolts in the 13th century, the barons were acting collectively for their own interests, which was a direct threat to the entire system of feudalism, based as it was upon single lords and vassals working out their own private arrangements. Military service was reduced to fixed terms, typically 40 days in England, in an effort to reduce the burden on nobles so that they did not leave their lands unattended for too long. However, 40 days was not usually enough to see out a campaign, and so a monarch was obliged to pay mercenaries, dealing another blow to the tradition of feudalism and vassalage.